Joyce.
And I'm Jess, and this is the Down to Earth podcast.
We're so glad to be here today. We want to just get right into this episode. In the first episode, we talked about how we can't underestimate or take for granted that we are people of power, that all of us, by virtue of the fact that we're living in the 21st century and that we have privileges that are unfathomable to the rest of history, we are people who have power, and we can't, as Christians, pretend that we don't have power and sort of take this ignorant kind of lay down in the dirt and I can't do anything about the world. But in this episode, we sort of want to unpack the flip side of that and discuss what it means to acknowledge that God has ultimate power and authority in the world. But also we want to acknowledge that in our own lives. And in some ways, this is a bit of a paradoxical tension that we have to straddle in our own lives every day. This idea that we are both people of power and yet we surrender that power to God.
Yeah, I think it's hard, that tension, right?
Yeah.
And that's where sometimes we abdicate any sort of responsibility toward the privilege that we talked about in episode 1. But it's also hard for us to accept that God has ultimate power and authority. And I think it's hard for a few reasons. One of the predominant reasons I see, at least in terms of pastoral work and talking to people in the real world, especially in Canadian culture, in the West, is we have bought into humanism pervasively. Even though we might call ourselves Christians, I don't know about you, Jess, but I feel like a lot of the discipleship challenges we're up against is because people are disciples of the culture more than they are disciples of Jesus. They know more about cultural values and ideologies than how Jesus taught us to live.
And sometimes confuse the two and assume that, like, I think this is a thing that a lot of people have heard, that the most quoted Bible verse is not a Bible verse.
Right.
God helps those that help
themselves.
And I often think... like movie culture has done this a lot, has pervaded this idea of you can do anything, you can be anyone, and you hear it in the voice of that narrator that's like, one man or one woman came out of nowhere and pulled themselves up by the bootstraps. And there's something about our fallenness that is, I mean, maybe it's not even our fallenness, but we are attracted to stories like that.
Yeah.
You can't get enough of stories like that.
Yeah. And I think we went after it a little bit in when we did the flourishing section in season 1, and we talked about becoming fully human. We talked about vocation, and like, you cannot do anything you want to do. Like, if you're not good at math, you're not going to be an astronaut. Like,
Please don't be a surgeon if you're not good at math.
Yeah.
Or at least admit that in your bio.
Right.
I suck at math, I may kill you.
Maybe you made fun of people who think that they're going to be like uber athletes, but they're not athletic. You're not going to compete at the Olympics.
Or singers.
Right.
Let me just have a shout out to all the people who think they're singers, but you're not.
Don't.
Please don't sing. We do love you.
Just sing in the group.
Just join a choir.
Yeah. Or not. Okay, but so this idea of God having all power and authority is circling back. Humanism is really hard because we actually believe in our own ability to become or to affect or to do the change, the deliverance, the saving, whatever it is, the stuff that we think we want to affect in the world. We think we can do that in our own strength.
And it's a very hard thing to diagnose in yourself.
Right.
Because, I mean, it's a little bit like pride. Like, it's a hard thing to say, yes, I am struggling with humanism. And so I think probably if we're all just truthful about it, we all struggle with this.
Right.
But it is what fuels, I think, some of the judgmentalism that's found in the church. So it is a big issue, this idea that when we try to be God, what happens is we get mad when people don't do what we think that they should do, when we think that we should be able to force people to do all the
and then you
things.
get power gone awry in terms of control, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Why else do you think it's hard for people?
I just think surrender is difficult. I just think it is a daily decision. And sometimes, for me at least, it's like a minute by minute decision.
Right. To trust that God
Because
is the one.
we give control and then we give it back, or we take it back. And I think ultimately that speaks to our nature as humans that, I mean, goes back to original sin, right? That we would try to elevate ourselves to the place of God.
Right.
So while, and this exactly outlines the tension, right? While we sometimes abdicate the power that we have, ultimately we're generally trying to be little gods.
Right. So if you're jumping in on episode 2 and you haven't listened to episode 1, now's the time to pause and go back and listen to episode 1 so you're not arguing with us the whole time about the fact that we do have power. We've talked about that a bit. And just in case you aren't aware, all of season 2 is about power. So we're going to be unpacking it a ton. But
I also think one of the reasons it's hard is because there's suffering in the world.
right.
And so, like, in the face of suffering and sorrow, it's sometimes difficult to have enough faith to go, yes, God, you are in control and you are all powerful.
Right.
I think especially this is defined especially for us when we're in a season of personal grief. So you're praying for something and you acknowledge mentally that God has all power, but it feels like in the moment, where are you, God? So really, do you have power? And so then what happens is this push-pull for us to like, well, I'm going to find God. If you're not going to do anything, I'm going to take control of this.
Right.
Like I think we have pictures of this in our own relationships. So like sometimes I'll say to Dave, my husband, could you do this? And he'll be in the middle of something. This is not a diss on Dave.
Right.
And if he doesn't do it right away, I'm like, fine then, I will do it. And I'm all huffy about it. And he looks at me and rolls his eyes, as is his custom, and will say, Jess, I was getting to that.
Right.
Just relax. Why are you...
But that is how we treat God sometimes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, it is.
In less trivial situations, especially. But I think you're right. The idea that it takes faith to trust that God's at work and will be. Yeah.
And I think there has been some misalignment on the idea of faith, but I am concerned. So in the 80s, like there was, weird theology that said you're not healed because you don't have enough faith. And that's nonsense. That's total bunkum. However, the pendulum has now swung, I think, all the way over to the other side where we basically say faith doesn't matter at all, which is not biblical or scriptural. Jesus kept saying over and over throughout the Gospels, hey, your faith has made you well. You have to have faith the size of a mustard seed. We've made the mustard seed like it's nothing.
Right.
Like it's microscopic.
Yeah, or in some cases, we've put it in, again, couched it in humanism. I'm going to think myself well.
Right.
Instead of turn my heart toward God.
Right, and surrender.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've got to do a deep dive into the Old Testament to think appropriately, thousands of years later, about God fighting for us or power. What does it mean for God to hold ultimate power and authority? And of course, there's no better story in the whole of the biblical narrative, in my opinion, than
I like how you caveated that with
in my opinion. Well, I think the central story for what it is to be the people of God, full stop, and for God to be who he is the story of the Exodus.
Right.
And we see that, in case you don't know, this is totally for free, but Matthew's gospel is a parallel to the book of Exodus, set up in the same format, which we won't unpack right now, but there's a reason it gets retold as Jesus being greater than Moses, etc., in the New Testament, because it's the orienting story. And so when I think about the Exodus story, the thing that strikes me is that if you wanted to get at one broad stroke emphasis, it's that God has ultimate power and authority, or he's the God of all gods. So how we understand God is really, really, really important. And this is an orienting story. So let's just think for a minute about the ancient Near East, the context in which the Exodus takes place. So many, many gods, right? They worshipped all kinds of different deities, and they had all kinds of rituals around the deities, and the deities held power over specific things in nature. And so, when you and I read the story of the plagues and how, Egypt got hit with the plagues, I don't know about you, but for a long time, until I did some study, I always thought it was super random.
Like God just had a basket of tricks. Now I'm going to deal with frogs. Now I'm going to... And it seemed like to me, there's just like gross things.
Right.
Like God was just... It was like that... remember that show that was on about 10 years ago? Fear Factory? Or
Right, Fear Factor.
Was it Fear Factor? Yeah,
Yeah.
Fear Factor. And like,
Not
it was just
factory.
like...
They were not manufacturing fear. Okay, thanks for that, Jess. So Fear
But it kind of
Factor.
seemed like Fear Factor.
Right.
Like God just was like producing this show
Yeah.
of like the grossest things. Like remember when people used to go in tanks with rats in it?
Yeah. Okay, let's not talk about that
Gross.
because I actually have phobias of certain
Caterpillars.
things. You're awful. She's just named my 2 biggest phobias. Okay, you can write in and tell us how I can get healed of my phobias. But it did feel a little bit like that. Like
Right.
the plagues were just like whatever would gross people out or whatever would like be their predominant phobia, scare the crap out of them to let my people go. But that is not what was happening. So in the procession, if you will, of the plagues, God's proving he's the one true God by annihilating all the lowercase gods, gods that Egyptians were worshiping. So he starts with the blood god. And well, technically the god of the Nile. So remember, this is the plague where the Nile, the big river, is turned into blood. And in that, he's confronting the god of the Nile, Hapi, or sometimes referred to as Apis, or Isis is the goddess of the Nile, or Khnum, which is the guardian of the Nile. So there's a kind of a trifecta of gods that he's addressing here. And he starts because it was also believed to be the bloodstream of another god they worshipped, which was Osiris. So he's believed to be reborn each year when the river was flooded. And ultimately, the river formed the basis of daily life and the national economy for Egypt. So it was completely devastated because then millions of fish died in the river and the water was unusable. And Pharaoh was told, "By this you will know that I am the Lord," Exodus 7:17. So here's a confrontation of numerous ways they understood deities, power, and authority within their culture.
Right.
And we're going to come to, who they'd set up as their ultimate power and authority.
Right.
But this is the first confrontation.
This is an important reason why we're doing this podcast, because I think for the Egyptians, they would have known that right away. For first century Near Eastern culture, they would have seen this right away. And this is why Bible study matters.
Right.
This is why it's not enough. So I've had a lot of people say to me, well, like, I just read the Bible and then God will speak to me. Yes, but context, historical understanding is important, and it's why we need each other.
And it's also why we need to read the freaking Old Testament. Can we say that?
Yeah.
Like the number of people I know who camp out in the New Testament, just read the Gospels or the Epistles, if they read their Bible, and maybe throw in a smattering of the Psalms for encouragement.
Right.
Like I cannot say enough how important it is that we're rooted to the whole of the scriptures. Mm-hmm. But this is a part of scripture that we don't like because God seems unkind.
A little bit mean.
Yeah, so we're going to come to that.
Next he goes to the blood in the Nile, and then the next is the frogs.
Right.
And I always thought this was just because it was gross, and as a child I remember thinking it's because, like, warts. I know that's not true, but...
Right.
But really what happened is Heket, I don't know if I've said that wrong.
Who knows? We're going to
Heket?
just be winging it with our Egyptian.
We're not Egyptian scholars.
No.
In case any of you were wondering. Heket was the frog-headed goddess of birth. And so when the frogs... so frogs were thought to be sacred.
Right.
Okay, so it's very unlike our culture today where frogs are like a pet for a child.
But think of India with the cows.
Right.
That's how they thought of frogs. They couldn't kill them.
Right, so when God had the frogs invade the land in every part of the homes of the Egyptians, and then when they died, they couldn't do anything about it. Like, so it stunk. And you realize that God killed what they believed to be sacred to show himself.
Right.
That
He's the only one
He's
sacred.
the only sacred one.
Yeah. Well, and then we get the lice and the gnats.
Gross.
Now, this isn't just replicating, because I think, like the frogs, that plague got replicated by the magicians.
Right.
They were like, the Egyptian magicians were like, okay, well, you can do that, Moses and Aaron. Well, we can do this, right? Mm-hmm. But then you get to the gnats or lice, sometimes it's described as. But it's not replicated. The magicians can't do this. And it's very important because in the Hebrew, the way it's described, the gnats coming about, is it means like they were brought out of nothing to bring out. So this is demonstrating God as creator, capital C, not as magician. So according to the Egyptians, Geb was the god who controlled the dirt and the land. But when God caused the dust to turn into these nasty little insects, he proved that Geb was not in control of the land. And whatever the true God ordered to come out of the ground did so and came out of nothing, which of course is then also, I think, referencing how we were created, Adam, out of the dust, right?
Right, tied to the creation story, to people who were created,
Right.
not people who were...
And then the magicians couldn't do that. So then you get the flies, and that's like a crazy swarm. Just as an aside, okay, long time ago in like 1985, we lived in this house in Ontario, and it was a farmhouse. And my sister had put like these cards. I don't remember what they were for, but she had put them in our windowsill in our bedroom. We shared a room. And my mom was vacuuming or cleaning or something, and she went to move one of the cards, and it was full of flies, like 600 or something, like crazy. And they flew out like a swarm, like it was something from a horror movie. She had to like run out of the room, slam the door, and then go in. I think that's when she went in with the vacuum cleaner, like to just try to get them. It was disgusting.
I feel that way a little bit with those aphids that are out in the fall.
This
You can't
year
even go
the aphids
they're
were
so bad.
Right, pestilence, plague.
Right.
But this is like small fry compared to what
Right.
these people were experiencing. So this fourth plague was actually a judgment on Uatchit. I have no idea how you say that name.
Sounds right. Sounds
Sure,
like
we're going to just say
Egyptian
that's the name
accent.
of the
Put that on
Egyptian
that.
god. This was the god who was believed to be the guardian of all life in the Nile Delta. So that whole sort of estuary water area. And this goddess is depicted with wings, and she wears a cobra symbol on her head like the pharaohs did. And so in this plague, God's again clearly distinguishing between the Israelites and the Egyptians because there was no swarms in the areas where the Israelites lived. In Exodus 8:21-24, it tells us it was just in the Egyptian context that they got this plague of flies. He can make anything fly. He can make anything come out.
Right.
He can make it unbearable. It's not gift.
Right.
From your goddess, this is curse, that kind of feeling.
So then the next one is the death of the livestock. And you can see here that God is going after like economy, like money, the things that cause them to be wealthy. And this was seen as a judgment on the goddess Hathor and the god Apsus, who are both depicted as cattle.
Right.
And Israel was again protected from this plague while the cattle of the Egyptians died. And God was steadily, you can see this when you understand the history, that God was steadily destroying the economy of Egypt while showing his ability to protect and provide for those who obeyed him. And Pharaoh even sent investigators to find out if the Israelites were suffering along with the Egyptians. But the result was the hardening of heart. This idea of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is always such a...
complex,
Yeah,
right?
it is complex, but you can see what God was doing here, that he was actually hitting at what they believed their center of power
was.
to be.
Right.
Like, and relentless about it.
Yeah, this isn't sort of like, an inconvenient day or week that they were experiencing. This is an ongoing, decimating, and then the boils come.
Right.
Which boils are
Boils
gross.
are gross.
Yeah, let's just say that. Anyone who's ever had a boil knows and not
gross.
pleasant. So this sixth plague was the judgment against several gods that they put as the gods of health. So attacking that through disease, especially Sekhmet, which was considered the powerful one. That's the way they understood it in their language, the god of healing. So this time, the Bible says again that the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. So clearly, these religious leaders were powerless against the gods of Israel. And that's really important that now we're seeing impact on, their religious voices, their authority figures. And then the hail comes. And we live in Alberta, people. Okay, so if you're not from Canada,
Or even Alberta, because I've only lived here 3 years. I've never seen hail like this before.
Okay, yeah. So Calgary gets crazy hail compared to other parts of the world. Now, I know that the insurance companies have gotten very fancy and they dump salt into the clouds.
They seed the clouds.
Yeah, it's called cloud seeding.
My
Who
husband
knew?
thought I was lying about this. He was like, why are there planes outside? And I said, they're seeding the clouds. And he thought I was making something up.
Who knows what the environmental impact is? Like my West Coast hippie self is really like concerned about environmental impact on this. But
I have a
anyways,
truck that can't get into my garage.
what
I'm
they
not
do
concerned.
is they're trying to like, kill the hail before it hits houses and
sometimes
cars.
the hail is so bad that it can like smash your car.
Oh, yeah.
Take off the siding off your house.
Yeah, it's bad. But anyways,
This is worse than that.
this is crazy. So before God sends the last 3 plagues, Pharaoh's given a special message from God that these plagues would be more severe than the others, and they're designed to convince Pharaoh and all the people, and here's a quote from Exodus 9:14, that there is none like me in all the earth. So here's the driving thesis.
Right. And I think
I'm the only true God.
You see this all throughout the Old Testament too, where God says, I am a jealous God. This is not, this idea of us ascribing power to God is non-negotiable in our walk with God.
Right.
He is always intent on us knowing that he is all powerful. And I mean, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but that's for our benefit at the end of the day.
So, and then we wonder about like the grace that we see starting to creep in here. So up until now, you let my people go and they don't. Okay, I'm going to give you a few more. And let my people go and they don't. But then here we get this caveat with the hail. God warns Pharaoh to gather whatever cattle and crops remained from the previous plagues to shelter them from the coming storm. So some of Pharaoh's servants actually heeded that warning and others did not. The 7th plague, hail, attacked Nut, the sky goddess.
It's a crazy name for a sky goddess.
It made me think of
If I was going to name a goddess, I don't think I'd name her Nut. Doesn't sound powerful.
what's the squirrel in Ice Age?
I don't know what that squirrel's name is. Does it have a name?
Scrat.
Oh, yeah.
And then Scrat's always chasing the crazy Nut. But anyways,
okay.
in the sky.
Yeah.
This is the sky goddess. And then we have Osiris, which is the crop fertility god, and we have Set, the storm god, and all 3 of these gods are getting addressed because this hail is unlike any that had been seen before. It was accompanied by a fire. So you got ice coming out of the sky and then fire, which runs along the ground, and everything left out in the open was devastated by the hail and fire. And again, God's people, the children of Israel, are miraculously protected and no hail damaged anything in their lands. Before God brought the next plague, he told Moses the Israelites would be able to tell their children of the things they had seen God do in Egypt and how God showed them his power. So then you get the 8th plague, which is the locusts. And again, this is focusing on the same gods, Nut, Osiris, and Set. So the later crops, the wheat and the rye, which had survived the hail, are now devoured by the swarm of locusts. There's going to be no harvest in Israel this year.
Speaking to the relentless nature of God's
All powerful.
all powerful, yeah.
100%.
So then you have the 9th plague, which is darkness, and I think probably we get to this plague and we, at some level, understand it if you have kids or
terrified.
you yourself are still terrified of the dark. And that was aimed at the sun god Re.
Right.
And so for 3 days, the land of Egypt was smothered with an unearthly darkness. And, the idea of darkness, even if we get over our fear of darkness, there is something that we as humans understand that with complete darkness, there is a dread. And then I think the final plague, the killing of the firstborn, the 10th and last plague, it was a judgment on Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh was believed to be, in the Egyptian culture, believed to be the son of Ra, the sun god, and therefore a god himself. And so this plague required an act of faith by God's people. They had to have the Passover meal, and you've heard of this, where they put blood on the outside of their door so that the angel of death would pass over them.
Yeah.
Hence the Passover. So the Israelites are again protected and the Egyptians devastated. But you can see in some ways, I remember as a child hearing about this plague and thinking it wasn't fair. Like a little bit of why did a boy have to die for this? But you can understand that because Pharaoh had exalted himself to the status of God.
Right. And then his son is believed to be
Son
the
of
next
God.
God
Yeah.
coming, right?
Right.
And the Son of God at that time.
Yeah.
The foreshadowing is kind of bonkers.
Yeah, the midrash about this is that the final plague, the killing of the firstborn, targets both the people and their most visible god, Pharaoh, and who also loses his oldest son and the successor to the throne. But I think what we have to see here is that what God was doing was completely annihilating the idea that there was anybody more powerful or who had more authority
Than him.
than him.
So even in that 10th plague, when Pharaoh once again hardens his heart, remember then they send the chariots after the Israelites, and God opens the way through the Red Sea for the Israelites. And then all of Pharaoh's army go rushing in, and then the water comes and drowns all of them. The power of Egypt is completely crushed, and fear of God spreads through the surrounding nations. We hear that at the beginning of Joshua. So God's saying he'll deal with the oppressor. And I think we have to remember that it isn't just sort of like, oh, this country had a lot of power. It's like, no, they had been leveraging their power in really horrible ways against
hundreds of
God's
years.
people. So he's going to oppress in the same measure as the oppression that's been given. And then he doesn't let Pharaoh get off the hook. He doesn't let him relent, hardens his heart. It's like the kid who wants to say sorry just to avoid a consequence, I think. Right. Like God's actually both punishing Pharaoh, like that sort of be sure your sins will find you out and you reap what you sow, but he's also proving his sovereignty. And ultimately, he's making the point that God himself will fight for his people. They'll never free themselves. And that's a really important point for us because that's still true. Mm-hmm. God is the only one who can save us. He's the only one who can deliver us. He's the only one who can set us free. And I think that that's lost for many of us in terms of how we understand our discipleship.
Right. And I think for those of us that are hyper about justice, I think oftentimes this story gets picked on as God being vindictive, when in fact, I think we have to see it as God being a God of justice.
Right.
That he doesn't let things go on and on and on. At some point, he steps in and brings justice.
Yeah, I think you're right. We also have a hyper individualism in our culture, right? So we're just thinking about the individual kind of impact of this.
Right.
Makes it hard for us to grasp that many thousands, millions of people would have suffered horrible atrocities because of the wickedness of this man and the rulers that came before him for 400 freaking years. And God answers all of that oppression of his people with the oppression of their people. And, you know, it's not easy math because God's not made in our image. So we have to be really careful of reducing our understanding of his judgment on the Egyptians for the horrors that these Jewish folks had endured for literally 4 centuries. So it sounds like he's mean. I think the plagues itself were like a year. Mm-hmm. So he answers 400 years of violence and oppression and rape and like pillaging and destruction and just
and a degradation of humanity, like a degradation of what it means to be a flourishing human.
So then I listen and I watch that and I go, there's very little loss of life.
Right.
And there was very little impact.
And in some ways, I think until you get to the last plague, a lot of it was symbolic.
Right.
Was symbolism. I mean, frogs are gross, but they are not going to kill you. And the symbolism was powerful and we do know, like when you had the hail, some people began to heed the voice of God, right?
Yeah, and they're starting to respond. So one thing I think is quite beautiful actually is when Jewish people practice the Seder meal, which is the special Shabbat supper that they have during Passover. One of the most dramatic moments is when they do the recitation of the 10 plagues. And I think it's Jill Jacobs, who's a rabbi, says, as we recite each plague, we spill a drop of wine in recognition, according to many interpretations, that the process of our liberation caused suffering to the Egyptian people. And so I think it's a beautiful acknowledgement that for them to get free, there was people that suffered, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that God was answering centuries of suffering and oppression and helping his people get free in that process. And I think that's the major premise of Exodus, If you want to understand what it is to be a person who follows God, God will fight for us, and God is mighty to save. We don't have to take things into our own hands. In fact, it'll end up in some measure of futility because he's ultimately the one with power and authority. And then, you know what? Like, you think this is loud and clear, and you certainly would think it would be loud and clear for the Israelites, right? Especially front row seat people like Moses.
Right.
But then we see Moses getting it so messed up later when he takes things into his own hands. He kills the Egyptian. Later on, he's striking the rock. And we know this precluded him from actually entering into the promised land. Instead of believing God would do it.
Well, you can see it's like bookends. He kills the Egyptians in the beginning, then God does all these miracles.
Right.
He kills the Egyptians, and then God does all these miracles. And you would expect that from then on, like if I'm telling this like a testimony,
right?
If I'm giving a video about this, I'm telling it like first. There's before Moses killed people when he wanted to take things in his own hand, and then God came and did all these miracles, and then his life has been trusting God ever since then. The problem with telling our stories like that is it actually causes us to give up on ourselves and
when we screw up,
or to hide it. So then it gets us into deceit.
Right.
But I think if we look at the picture of Moses, you see that, okay, so he killed the Egyptian, he saw God do miracles, and then he struck the rock. I think we have to acknowledge the human tendency to take back control.
Yeah, and exercise power in our own strength.
And that perhaps being human is saying, every day, God, I've got to give you control. None of us are beyond. I think what we have to remember is that none of us are beyond saying to God, help me to surrender control to you. Help me to surrender total power and authority to you.
So, most of us would never have heard of any of these Egyptian gods, other than maybe the sun god, because we still see that one. Periodically, we would identify it culturally as still belonging to Egypt. But what are the gods, like where does the rub come for us, I think, as followers? Those of us who are listeners who say, yeah, I follow Christ. What does this story have to do with real time?
Right, because we have to get on the ground for what it's like. God just told us this story to, like a bedtime story.
Right.
Which is, in fact, what I think a lot of us do with the Old Testament.
Right.
We tell our children these stories
like
so that,
rhymes.
like Cinderella. Like I tell my children Cinderella, and at Easter we watch the 10 Commandments.
Right.
And that's so. Like, what's the point? And I think and as you and I were kind of talking about this, I think the thing that we realize is that God will use power to confront the gods of our day and time. And I know right away people push back. Oh, we don't have gods. Yes, we do. We just don't give them.
Sure. Well, even the New Testament, you can't serve both God and mammon.
Right.
Right. Like that's New Testament era.
And I think we think that's just like that was an Old English. Paul talked in a British voice and had an Old English name for money, mammon.
Mammon. No, but then money is still the big god in our culture.
Right, and mammon was a god.
Yeah.
Name of a god.
Right.
So you see that the New Testament is still tying us
correlating
back to this Exodus story.
Yeah.
And I think, if we're going to confront the gods of our age, I think money is it's a god of our age, particularly in the West.
Yeah.
Particularly, like I think we don't realize it's a god because it's all around us until we get into positions where we don't have access to it.
Sure.
In which case, then you're really, really aware that it is a god. I think when Dave and I were pastoring in the inner city, like, I can remember thinking, like, I don't even know, we don't even have enough money to breathe. Like, some weeks the offering would cost us money.
Right.
How does that happen, you say? Oh, I'll tell you. You know how it happens when people write checks for money they don't have. And if you get enough people in your congregation that are writing bounce checks. So NSF checks cost you $25 each one, right? This is
some
in the
people
90s.
Listening don't even know what a check is.
Okay, that's for you.
That's how it works back in the day.
So we would get sometimes like 10 or 15 or 20 checks that all bounced. So then your offering is negative 500.
Brutal.
So, like, we had to confront this idea that...
is it an abstract thing God will provide for us?
Yeah,
I
remember thinking, like, in some ways, like, God, like, okay, on Monday morning, I'd feel like, okay, God, I guess you'll be our provider. So I'd go and check the mailbox like 50 times, thinking that I could be like one of those televangelists that was like, and then I went to my mailbox and there was $1 million check. And this was sort of in the era of, do you remember when like the princes from different countries would write you an email? Okay,
Right.
so before this was ubiquitous, like when the internet just kind of was, this tells you
You're
that
old.
I'm old.
Yeah.
But somebody wrote us like some prince who owned a toilet paper factory. And we were so poor that he had given us, he saw our ministry and he knew that we were helping people in the inner city and he wanted to give us his toilet paper factory. Now, okay, perhaps I should have known a toilet paper factory, but I didn't know anybody that ever gotten an email like this. So we were so poor that I was like,
Suckered right in.
well, we weren't that suckered, but kind of. I did believe it for a
Initially,
day.
yeah, for about
Initially, I
5
was like, we
seconds.
are going, praise God. God is going to use toilet paper.
No, wrong.
We had to confront that. Like, was our system, who was ultimately going to have the say?
Right. Which I think, Colossians gets at this. We won't unpack it all, but confronting empire. Like
Right.
the idea of like what the culture says is the thing. Is it really the thing?
Right.
And money, however we cut it, our lives revolve around money and economy and trade and being able to survive.
And money's not a bad thing. Just like some of these
Right.
things in the Egyptian world, like the Nile was clearly not a bad thing. It was a gift from God.
Right.
But anything that controls you,
Sure.
and anything that doesn't allow you to really trust
Trust God.
God and give him power
That's
is
the
like a
key.
God.
It's the thing that we depend on instead of God.
Right. So I think what we began to ask ourselves, and so then clearly we knew money had a hold on us. Like I wouldn't have said that about myself, but when I didn't have it, I recognized that I was a mess.
Right.
So
And
then
you get tempted to try to solve it all in your own
Right.
strength.
And then in the end of the day, you realize that God solved it by bringing like very unlikely people who were poor and who
right.
you just think, how did God provide through that person? And that's what God does. So it caused me though then to think about
Yeah.
what are the other areas of my life where I think that I've given God control, but if it were taken away from me, I would panic, right? And so
So,
that's been
yeah.
the litmus test in my life to say, what are the gods in my life?
Yeah. I think it's telling, just while we're talking about money for a minute, that all the vice lists in the New Testament, like these ones will not inherit the kingdom. The vice lists,
Right. Always go to
greed always is in the list.
Right, but no one ever preaches a
No,
sermon
when have
on
you ever
greed.
heard it? No, we do not, because we don't want that to get touched. So I think it's fair to say that if we take our discipleship seriously, we have to be willing to look at how we spend money, whether we have generous hearts with money, whether we have fear governing us with money, like what's going on between us and money and Jesus.
And partly, I think, asking ourselves the question, if it were taken away, how would I respond?
good question.
Because I even wonder this, just like about, I think in some ways the nuclear family has become a god of our age.
Right.
Particularly in evangelical circles. I think we've taken a good thing, the family, and have elevated it to the status of God.
Right.
And I do think this is a God we must confront with power, because we have no grid now to say that no, God is more important than that. And if
Right.
that were all taken away from me, I would still bless the name of God.
Well, we see it in lots of, like, here's some good things, right? Like, it's important that we spend time with our kids and with our spouse and blah, blah, blah. But when that tips to sort of an idolatrous stage
Yes.
is when we no longer can welcome the stranger.
Yes.
And we can't make room at our table for somebody that is hungry. We don't want anybody interrupting our, like, private sanctum of family life. And I don't think Jesus calls us to live that way. The radical invitation of the gospel and to follow Christ is to make room for others.
Right.
So you kind of can get at it now. We've in our family, we've had to say, okay, sometimes we have too many people in
Right,
our home.
right, sure.
And we got to find balance.
There's balance, but this, again, we go back to the gospel
Heart.
being a tension. There's paradoxical tension in it. If there's no paradox and no tension in your walk with God, then I would suggest that you're not grappling with the things
Sure.
that you have to grapple with.
Can we talk about sex?
Yes.
Because I think that's another idolatry in our culture.
Right.
We live in such a hypersexualized culture, and I know in any society throughout history, there's always something about sex that's like a hinge. But I think it's so inflamed right now culturally. And that is largely because I think our identity is too tied to our sexuality.
Well, and partly you know this because the idea of celibacy has gone off the table. Like nobody ever talks about that. Like if you're celibate, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
Right. And so again, what we're getting under there is that we cannot imagine our lives without that.
Right. Or you're not fully human if you're not getting any.
Right.
And that if something was to happen in my life where I lost a partner or I don't know, say I was in a season of singleness, that I'm not fully alive. So it's okay to have casual sex, or it's okay because God didn't really mean for, like it's equated with eating and sleeping and breathing.
Right. And also, like, I think, so again, I think this is a pendulum swing. We've had this idea that I think the church was quite repressed in this area before. So we shamed people into thinking.
Right.
But then the pendulum is the other way, that there is no line. There's no demarcation of sin.
Right.
And you cannot read the scripture and tell me that there is no demarcation of sin in this area.
Right. So we would have to be willing, again, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing as money. So have I surrendered my whole life to Christ? Am I willing to have God speak to me about my sexuality? Is celibacy, in my view, curse instead of gift? Right. Well, what does God say about that? And why does he say that that could be flourishing for us?
Right.
So wherever we're trying to be in control or have all the power, all the authority, that's the issue. And I think, you and I were talking recently about power and control, and like we actually use those words conjoined in our culture quite often, right? Yeah. Because on some ontological level, how we understand power is tied to how we exercise control.
Absolutely. So I would say this for homework, for all of our listeners, if you do homework, that a good question to ask yourself is, where would my life fall off the rails? Like, in what area am I not willing to go without, or to give up control, or to... So, like, for some of us, it's going to be different for different ones of us. But those are the areas where it feels like I can't even imagine that. I can't even talk about that. I can't even...
Or any area where we're trying to save ourselves, or find our own freedom, or deliverance, like these kinds of language that we hear in the story of the Exodus.
Right.
How are we doing that in our own life? And like Jesus saves us, right? So there's this idea in scripture that we are saved. Mm-hmm. There's a line of demarcation. Sometimes we talk about it like old life and new life. But then the New Testament seems to indicate we are still being saved.
And we will be saved.
Right. And so let's not lose sight of that. Like, that the line of demarcation was once, okay, I gave my heart to Christ. But no, we keep giving our lives, like the daily surrender, and trusting God to be all-powerful in our narrative.
Right.
Personally and as the people of God, full stop.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think in my own life, the times where I've been able to give more control to God and surrender to God are the moments where I have confronted my own fears about things.
Right.
Fear is generally a very good indicator that there is a lack of control. So, or not a lack of control, a lack of giving up control.
Right,
to
freedom.
God. Right.
Freedom and fear are kind of opposites.
Yeah, so maybe you just take some time this week to just ask the Lord, where am I living in a bit of fear, and where haven't I given you ultimate power and control? Because ultimately that's going to bring us more freedom.
Yeah, it's awesome. Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or go to our website at
www.downtoearthpodcast.com. Feel free to leave us a review wherever you find your podcasts, and spread the word.